Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today from wherever in the world you are. My name is Marga Monfarid, and I work for the International Coral Reef Initiative Secretariat, which is a global partnership for the preservation of coral reefs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next For Coral webinar within our series in partnership with the Reef Resilience Network, hosted under the United States of America Secretariat. The topic today is the status of the 4th Global Bleaching Event and the role of the global coral reef community. So just before we start, we have some quick housekeeping to go through. So we do ask that you remain muted throughout the call. Should you wish to speak, please use the raise the hand feature in the reaction section, and then we'll then unmute you and allow you to take the floor. Presenters will have control of their own screen, but in the case of technical issues, please notify Tom Dallison or myself, as we have backup copies. Presentations will all be delivered in English only, but interpretation will be provided into French and Spanish. So at the bottom of your Zoom link, you should see this little symbol, and you'll be able to flip between the channels for the interpretation there. For the best quality audio experience, we do recommend using a headset and microphone if possible, particularly if you are speaking or asking questions or when we come to the discussion section. As you can see, the meeting is also being recorded, and it will be shared alongside the meeting's presentations via the dedicated event page after the webinar. And lastly, we kindly encourage each participant to have their video on throughout the entire duration of the meeting, as this will enhance the overall meeting experience. So just a quick overview of the agenda, which will last about 2 hours. We'll have welcoming remarks from Jennifer Koss, and then we'll move into our presentation topics. So the 4th Global Bleaching Event, we'll hear from Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, then we'll hear from the Red Sea, the Western Indian Ocean, the Caribbean and France, before a very short question and answer session, and then about a half-an-hour discussion on the next steps and role of the global coral reef community. This will also be moderated by Jennifer Koss, and then we'll also have some concluding remarks from Jennifer Koss. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Jennifer Koss, who is the Director of NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Programme and current ICRI co-chair. Since 2015, Jennifer has created an ambitious vision and strategic plan for coral conservation and management efforts at NOAA, and holds key national and international positions. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margot. Hello, and welcome everyone to ICRI's 5th webinar in the For Coral webinar series. Today's webinar will cover the status of the 4th Global Coral Bleaching Event, as well as a discussion on our community's response. As Margot said, I am Jennifer Koss, Director of the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Coral Reef Program. I've had the pleasure of co-chairing ICRI for a couple of years now with Christine Dawson. I think we're both going to be very sad to pass it on. It's been a dynamic and active few years, but very rewarding nonetheless. This is the 5th webinar in the For Coral webinar series, and there are more webinars in the queue, I'm happy to say. The ICRI Secretariat has had several successful side events at the recent international fora, and preparations are underway for the 38th ICRI General Meeting in Jeddah, which will be in Saudi Arabia. We're looking forward to seeing many of you there. Despite this global bleaching event and other challenges we face in conserving and restoring coral reefs, the collective efforts, innovative solutions, and unwavering commitment demonstrated by individuals on this call and beyond serve as a beacon of hope and optimism for the future of coral reefs. I really appreciate everyone being here today for this topic. I'm even more grateful for the collaboration from ICRI members in announcing the current global bleaching event and the community's response to it right from the start. Seeing you here all today reminds me that there is much reason for hope and optimism, and this group has what it takes to find the solutions to the challenges our coral reefs face. Therefore, I must take a moment to sincerely thank you all for your passion, dedication, and perseverance in finding the mental, physical, and emotional bandwidth to continue this work. It has not been an easy year. All of us are on the front lines of seeing what's going on, and it's taking a toll on all of us. And on a really personal note, working with Derek really closely on messaging has been difficult, and not always seeing the type of response that we'd like to see from colleagues in media despite what we're trying to say in our interviews, has also been frustrating. I'm hoping we can share more about how to message and how to convey that we're taking this situation very seriously, but there are also reasons to be hopeful that we can sustain corals and hopefully recover them in the future. So by hosting this webinar today, we seek to raise awareness of the challenges we all face, but more importantly, it's the solutions we're implementing. By sharing them with each other, we hope to achieve a collective understanding of the current bleaching status globally and steps forward to address it. I really look forward to exchanging ideas and solutions with everybody, and I'm confident that we can successfully weather this and the next bleaching event together. Back over to you, Margot.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'd also like to just echo what she said about the reason for hope and optimism. So I think that's a great way to start, and also why everyone is here today. So our next speaker is Derek Manzello, who is the coordinator of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch Programme, an effort focused on the monitoring of coral reef ecosystems through satellite and in situ observations. Derek will be giving us an overview of the 4th Global Bleaching Event. So over to you, Derek.
Thank you very much, Margot. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. All right, can you all see that well?
Yes, all good.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you all today. My name is Derek Manzello. I'm the coordinator of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch. Quickly becoming the least popular person in the coral reef science community, unfortunately, because of the global bleaching event that is taking place. Today, I'm going to talk to you about trends and patterns that we've seen in accumulated heat stress across the global oceans since 2023. Just so we're all on the same page, last December at Coral Reef Watch, we revised our previous bleaching alert level categorizations. We wanted to provide more context for the potential ecological ramifications of increasing levels of heat stress. And also, you know, frankly, if you look at the plot on the right, by the end of October last year, the entire Caribbean region was just a blanket of alert level 2 conditions. And this was not properly reflecting the variability and basically the intensity that the heat stress had achieved. So we dug into the literature and basically looked at a potential upper bound for when we can expect very, very severe heat stress impacts. So there's been 4 examples in the literature where degree heating weeks have exceeded 20. This occurred in the Galapagos Islands first in 1983, and then twice in Kiribati and once in Jarvis since. And in those 4 cases, coral mortality of the entire coral community ranged from 89 to 99%. So at a bleaching alert level 5, this is analogous to a category 5 hurricane or cyclone. And this is when we expect a risk of more than 80% of the corals on your reef dying, unfortunately. Taking a step back, the bleaching alert level 4 is parameterized based on the response of coral reefs in the US Virgin Islands in 2005. So in that event, the reefs there experienced about 15 to 16 degree heating weeks and experienced a 60% decline in coral cover. So we also modified our bleaching alert level 2 definition. Originally, the original definition kind of made it seem that once you hit an alert level 2 or 8 degree heating weeks, that everything was going to die. Well, nature in reality is far more complex than that. This doesn't mean that alert level 2 is not a very serious thing to consider. We know that severe coral mortality can occur at alert level 2 conditions, or even sometimes less than alert level 2 conditions. And a great example of that is what happened on the Northern Great Barrier Reef in 2016. However, when a reef experiences subsequent bleaching events, oftentimes what we see is that there can be a change such that the reef is exhibiting higher resistance to bleaching level heat stress. Now, we could have a week-long webinar about why that's happening, but that's something to keep in mind. So at an alert level 2, we're saying this is when reef-wide bleaching will become severe, and you're looking to start seeing mortality of the heat-sensitive corals, species, and genotypes. Alert level 3 is simply the logical intermediary between an alert level 2 condition and an alert level 4 condition. So this shows you max degree heating weeks since January 2023. Any color warmer than yellow indicates where mass bleaching is expected. The reds is when we hit that alert level 2 condition, and we expect mortality to begin. So showing the same figure in the bleaching alert area space, and also highlighting with these little stars where we received confirmed reports of bleaching. You can see that we now have 57 countries and territories that have reported severe bleaching since February of 2023. We just recently added India and Thailand to this list. And in Thailand, they've already taken action to close Pling Island to reduce potential ancillary impacts from tourists during this coral bleaching event. So how does this event compare to previous events? Well, if you look at maximum degree heating weeks that have been experienced in the last year, since January 2023, and you look at that relative to the previous maximum in the entire satellite record, you can see that this event has really been most severe in the wider Caribbean as well as the South Atlantic. So the Atlantic Ocean is really bearing the brunt of this event. This doesn't mean that what's happening elsewhere isn't severe, as we just saw in the Great Barrier Reef and elsewhere, and we'll learn today later. But basically, aside from the Southern Great Barrier Reef, the Seychelles, and that central equatorial Pacific region, this event really hasn't been record-setting anywhere else except for the wider Caribbean and the South Atlantic. So ranking the 4 global bleaching events, there's a very simple index that was developed by William Skirving called the Global Coral Bleaching Event Index. This simply measures the percentage of reef area around the globe that has experienced bleaching level heat stress in the last 365 days. So if we look at this current event relative to the previous events, we see that during the first global bleaching event in 98, 20% of the reef area around the world experienced bleaching level heat stress within the 365-day window. This went up to 35% in 2010. And then during the 3-year-long global bleaching event in 2014 to 2017, this peaked at 56.1%. As of May 12th, we're currently at 60.2% and increasing. So what does this mean? Well, in 1998, it's estimated that about 8% of the world's corals died, and there was a further 14% loss from 2009 to 2018. Again, I really want to highlight that this event is really just wreaking havoc in the Atlantic Ocean. Pretty much every coral area that harbors corals, reef-building tropical corals in the Atlantic has experienced bleaching level heat stress in the last year. So what does the future hold? Well, currently our 4-month coral bleaching outlook is showing that by the end of June, the Southern Caribbean is going to once again experience bleaching level heat stress. This will creep up into the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef by July. And then in August, bleaching level heat stress is predicted to start accumulating in the Lesser Antilles, the Greater Antilles, and Florida. As well in the Western Central Equatorial Pacific Ocean, creeping over there to the Coral Triangle and in the South China Sea, Taiwan, Japan. And unfortunately, pretty much the entirety of the Northern Indian Ocean is expected to experience bleaching level heat stress, and much of it already has, unfortunately. Good news, El Nino is going away. We're currently transitioning to ENSO neutral, and La Nina is expected to develop by Northern Hemisphere summer with a 69% chance that we will be in La Nina conditions by the end of September. But we need to keep in mind that we are really in a strange time for global ocean sea surface temperatures. The entire global ocean is much, much hotter than average, and it has been now for over a year. Now, any nugget of hope in this image, well, let me explain this image first. So what you're looking at here is daily average sea surface temperature around the planet relative to the average conditions or the climatology for that time of the year for each ocean pixel. So anything that's yellow or orange shows you where on the planet conditions are warmer than average. Anything that's blue, that's cooler than average. And that's kind of what we want to see. Now, the good news here is we see the characteristic of La Nina developing, that blue tongue that's most intense right there in the northern Galapagos Islands and propagating west along the equatorial eastern Pacific. That is the quintessential indication that La Nina is setting up. And that's good news. And it's my hope that once we transition to La Nina, that we're going to peak that global bleaching index and hopefully it'll start coming down. But this doesn't mean we're out of the woods, because we have to remember that mass bleaching is now occurring during all phases of ENSO. The Great Barrier Reef bleached in 2022. This was the first time we had a mass bleaching event during La Nina on the GBR. So we're getting to the point, or we've gotten to the point essentially, where ocean temperatures have warmed to the point that we're seeing large-scale bleaching events out of phase with El Nino, and they're basically occurring now during La Nina and ENSO neutral. So what's very concerning for me, I don't mean to take the attention away from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but we're already starting to accumulate degree heating weeks in the Southern Caribbean. Now, this is bonkers. This is so much earlier than has ever happened before. To show you these graphs, so these are from Caribbean Panama, so the Bocas del Toro region, Nicaragua, Caribbean Costa Rica, and Caribbean Colombia. And what you're looking at here is all of the daily average sea surface temperature data for the entire satellite record there and those squiggly lines on top, and then the accumulation of degree heating weeks there on the bottom. So the black lines are 2024, the gray line is 2023, and I've highlighted showing that we're already accumulating degree heating weeks down in Caribbean Panama and that Bocas del Toro region, which is very concerning because this is one of the first places we saw bleach last year, beginning in June. So again, that ugly word of unprecedented is unfortunately going to get thrown around again. I really hope to get to the point where I have to stop using that word. But again, we're seeing unprecedented patterns in heat stress accumulation in the Caribbean already, a couple months in advance of what happened last year, and last year was record-setting. So in summary, severe coral bleaching is reported from at least 57 countries and territories spanning all ocean basins. As of May 12th, 60%, more than 60% of the world's coral reef area has experienced bleaching level heat stress within the past 365 days. The impacts from this event are going to take some time to fully document. Some of the impacts can be severe and immediate in places that are still dominated by heat-sensitive acropora, so the Western Pacific, Indian Ocean areas. You can see impacts rapidly in those locations, as well as in acropora in the Caribbean. We know there's been some pretty drastic, severe losses of acropora spanning the entirety of the wider Caribbean. But it's still going to take time to know the full ramifications. That's because corals can have delayed responses and sometimes not die for a year or even more after bleaching goes away. The first publication documenting this event did come out from the Huatulco area of Oaxaca in the Mexican Pacific. That area experienced alert level 4 conditions, and they saw 50 to 93% mortality on the post-elaporate reefs in that location. So we need monitoring data both during bleaching and 1 to 2 years after the heat stress subsides. And the idea here is to identify resilient reef species and genotypes in hopes of providing a blueprint for how to save corals during the next inevitable coral bleaching event. Finally, these are strange days for global ocean temps. To the right there is daily average sea surface temperature for the entire planet. On the bottom is just the North Atlantic. That black line is where we are now. That's 2024. That orange line is 2023. And this image should be frightening all of us because 2023 was horrific, and we're currently well above that for the globe. Talk about shifting baselines. I mean, I got excited when that 2023 line started matching the 2024 line down there in the North Atlantic, but it's again creeping back up. But again, the whole point here is that we're still running much, much hotter than average. This marine heat wave does not look like it's going away anytime soon. And I just want to point out that this is, primarily a Caribbean-focused statement, but it may become increasingly important for the rest of the world as coral abundances decline. We need to understand the timing of subsequent disease and corallivore outbreaks, because this could give us opportunities to save more corals. Preventing a local extinction event can be as simple as picking off Drupelid or Coralliophilus scales from corals. I do want to call out the Coral Reef Watch team for making all of these great figures and data available. Gong Liu, Jackie Delacour, Eric Geyer, William Skirving, Blake Spady, and Ajanori, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Derek, for that very detailed and informative presentation. I agree, good riddance to El Nino, but good to know that we still need to keep our eyes alert and alert in the waters with everything that's going on. And also the fact that it will take time to understand the ramifications of this bleaching event. So I think that's good to note. Our next speaker is David Waichenfield, who has worked on the Great Barrier Reef for over 30 years in a career spanning tourism, marine park management, and science. David is currently the Research Programme Director for the Reef Ecology and Monitoring Programme at AIMS. The floor is yours, David.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Margot. While I am setting up my screen share and getting my presentation running, I just want to quickly acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia's tropical marine estates, particularly our coral reefs. I would like to acknowledge those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as our first scientists and the traditional custodians of the Australian environment for about 70,000 years. So it's very lucky for me to be following on from Derek because he's already introduced the global situation, and I'm going to build in a couple of minutes on that in this region. I am tonight just filling in for Britta Schefelka, who is enjoying some well-earned leave. Britta is both the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network Global Coordinator and also the Australian Region Coordinator. And I am doing my best to fill those shoes while she's away. My day job is to run the research and monitoring program for the Australian Institute of Marine Science on the Great Barrier Reef. So I think some of Australia's coral reef estate is very well known to everybody, but it's much more widespread, I suspect, and some parts of it are very much not famous. So on the east coast, I think very famously, we have the Great Barrier Reef, but we also have further to the east out in the Western Pacific, the Coral Sea. I think many people don't realize that we have extensive coral reef territories in the Eastern Indian Ocean, particularly on and close to our western coastline. So the Ningaloo Reef System, which is also a World Heritage Area, but also reef systems around Pulu Keeling and Christmas Island. Out in the southern Western Pacific, Lord Howe Island and Norfolk Island also have coral reef systems. So all up, Australia has about 42,000 square kilometres of coral reef habitat, which represents about 17% of the global coral reef habitat. It's obviously spread across 2 ocean basins, 2 World Heritage Areas, 12 marine ecosystems of the world ecoregions. And within all of that vast country, there is a huge variability in ecological, biological, physical, oceanographic conditions. So not surprisingly, when we look at the Australian coral reef estate, we see very different things happening in different places. So this is one of the very similar to one of the graphics that Derek showed, although zoomed in to the Western Pacific. So looking here at degree heating weeks, as Derek explained, the warmer the color, the greater the amount of stress. To cut a long story short, out of all of those varied Australian coral reef territories, the Great Barrier Reef was exposed to the highest heat stress in the summer that is just finished. And I will go into more detail on the Great Barrier Reef than any of the other locations, both because it was subject to more stress than anywhere else, but also because it is amongst Australia's coral reef estate, probably the best studied part. I would draw your attention to the very significant area on the west coast of Australia, where absolutely no heat stress accumulated whatsoever. So a very varied picture across the Australian estate in this past summer. So I'm actually going to start with the good news and then move on to the not so good news. So in Western Australia, where, as I said, we've got coastal reef systems such as Ningaloo, but we've got also offshore reef systems such as Scott Reef, Rolly Shoals. We've been conducting surveys through April and May. Typically, if marine heatwave and bleaching conditions develop in this part of the world, they do so actually after the completion of the Southern Hemisphere summer. And so far, the news is good. We're looking at minor bleaching with a little bit of mortality. We do still have more surveys coming for parts of that Eastern Indian Ocean area later this month. But at the moment, both from in-water observations and from the degree heating weeks, it looks like the Western Australian or Eastern Indian Ocean coral reef estates have done fairly well. Similarly, out in the Coral Sea, although one word of caution, which is that our surveys out there were in February to early March, so they were before the peak in heat. So this is probably an underestimate at this point, but certainly out there in the Coral Sea Marine Park, we've seen mild to moderate levels of bleaching, and that is very much focused particularly in thermally susceptible species. And also signs of recovery from previous bleaching events. So mostly good news from the Coral Sea at this stage. Also in the Western Pacific, but much further south, Norfolk Island Marine Park, again, looking at surveys that were conducted in March. Yes, there was bleaching with 15% of corals bleached and 32% showing signs of paling. Interestingly, the Acropora was more or less okay. More affected were Poeciloptera and some of the massive coral growth forms. They are looking at follow-up surveys there later this month. And the other part of that sort of southern coral reef estate in the Western Pacific, Lord Howe Island, we do not yet have information from there. So that was the good news. Now let me switch to talking about the Great Barrier Reef. Again, these are degree heating week maps from Coral Reef Watch in NOAA. I want to emphasize this is a different color scheme, but very clearly the blue colors are at the very low end where we wouldn't expect to see much, if any, coral bleaching, and the deep red colors are where we're expecting to see severe coral bleaching and mortality. One of the points I really want to make here is that although 2016, 2020, and 2024 were certainly amongst the most serious bleaching events we've ever seen, they're all very different. And I want to emphasize that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is 344,000 square kilometers, so bigger than 2/3 of the countries on the planet. And therefore, not surprisingly, each bleaching event is not the same. Each bleaching event varies greatly inshore, offshore, north to south. And I will emphasize that variability again in just a second, but certainly 2024 is right up there in terms of seriousness and severity with previous bleaching events. And in fact, 46% of the 3,800 coral reefs on the Great Barrier Reef this year saw the greatest levels of heat stress that they have ever seen, though we did not get to the sorts of numbers that most of the Caribbean saw in the previous Northern Hemisphere summer. So again, just broadly comparing different events, we can clearly see that the world for the Great Barrier Reef has changed very markedly since about 2016. And certainly the 2024 event is right up there in terms of the amounts of heat stress with what we saw in 2016 and 2017, which were severe events that also brought high levels of coral mortality. Also up there with 2020, which interestingly, as far as our surveys can tell us, although those surveys were severely hampered by COVID in 2020, 2020 wasn't a particularly high mortality event. So that remains an interesting phenomenon that we need to look into more and explain. These are the results of our aerial surveys. The Australian Institute of Marine Science conducts these whenever there is the need in a marine heatwave condition with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, who are our partners in looking at reef health over the summer. And indeed, it's the Reef Authority that takes the lead in providing weekly reef health updates over the Great Barrier Reef as the summer progresses. And again, these aerial survey results, I want to emphasize two things. One is that they very closely follow the patterns of heat stress. So the bleaching and the heat stress are worst in the southern quarter of the marine park. Up in the extreme north of the marine park, really not that bad. Lots of reefs with no bleaching whatsoever. A very mixed picture in between. So in particular, many of our offshore reefs, which are on the edge of the continental shelf, have done quite well, presumably because of upwelling of cooler waters, but not necessarily. And we can also see patterns of cumulative impact. So we had 2 cyclones this year, both of which brought severe flooding and some wind damage. And we can see that not all of the bleaching is totally explicable by heat stress, but there's an influence of freshwater stress as well. But again, certainly this is one of, if not the worst bleaching event we've ever seen, but it's very variable as we look across the length and breadth of the Great Barrier Reef. We are just beginning to get a handle on mortality. I don't want to go into this in great detail, but we've got mortality-oriented surveys at 56 reefs on the Great Barrier Reef, again looking to capture the north-south variation and the inshore-offshore. In the worst affected areas, we have already seen 75% mortality, but that again is very variable. There are other reefs with almost no mortality whatsoever. We are using some fairly new and sophisticated methods in terms of photogrammetry, and I just want to quickly change my screen to a website. This is an inshore reef, so these are actually healthy corals. They're quite dark, but that's because they've got a lot of zooxanthellae in them because the inshore Great Barrier Reef is fairly turbid. But a few weeks later, this is what that exact same area of coral reef looked like, where every single piece of coral that is there was very severely bleached. We're already seeing high mortality in this area, which is the Keppel Islands. Just going to quickly switch back to the slides. And then I really want to emphasize that, of course, a bleaching event is a terrible thing, but it represents a huge opportunity to learn about the impacts of climate change, to see how corals are adapting naturally, and also how our R&D into the reef restoration and adaptation program, what can we learn about natural rates of adaptation in order to implement interventions into the future? So yes, this is a very confronting event, but we are doing everything we can to maximize the scientific learning from it in order to better protect reefs into the future. And Margot, I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for that very detailed and comprehensive overview of the status of coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Although bleak, like you say, what can we learn moving forward as well? Our next speaker is Walter Rich, a postdoctoral fellow at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, in Saudi Arabia. He has over 5 years of experience in the Red Sea and has had the opportunity to explore coral reefs along most of the Saudi Arabian coastline. So over to you, Walter.
Thank you, Margot. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? Well, yeah,
yes,
thanks everyone.
Working well.
Okay, thanks, Margot. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm excited to be here and show you our perspective from the Red Sea, at least from the Saudi Arabian Red Sea. I am presenting on behalf of Dr. Matthew Thibault. He's the one who put together this presentation, and he's unfortunately on a boat right now doing field work, so he asked me to fill in for him. But I've been involved with a lot of the what I'm going to be showing you today, but Matt really has been spearheading a lot of the efforts that I'm about to show you here. Okay, so first of all, we've had a lot of people within our own research center here, the Red Sea Research Center at KAUST, contributing resources and personnel. We have several professors here who have a lot of technicians, students, research scientists, postdocs who've been in the water trying to gather as much information as we can about this latest bleaching event, which started for us around September last year and went right through November. We also have been trying to increase collaboration with other government agencies within Saudi Arabia. So just to give you some context, there hasn't really been historically a centralized monitoring program within Saudi Arabia. So what we know about past bleaching events is kind of pieced together from different research groups and universities and agencies throughout Saudi Arabia and some of the other countries that border the Red Sea. So Matt, over the last couple of months, has been spearheading this effort to try to get everyone in the same room, so to speak, and increase data sharing and collaboration between all these different groups, so we have a better idea, a more cohesive picture of the bleaching event this last year. So a lot of these different groups have visited certain reefs or have gone at different times of the year, so we have kind of piecemeal pictures of the Red Sea we're trying to put together now. So just to give a very brief history of the bleaching events in the Red Sea. a lot of people might think of the Red Sea as a very hot area with thermally tolerant corals, which is true to an extent, but by no means are they immune to bleaching. So we have evidence of bleaching, moderate bleaching, at least from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. I think 2010 might be one of the first times that we've had more comprehensive surveys in the Red Sea, at least in the central Red Sea where KAUST is located. There was a paper published a few years after the 2010 bleaching event, so that's been documented. And in 2015, much like the rest of the world, it was really catastrophic, and especially in this area here in the south central Red Sea, known as the Farasin Banks. There used to be really spectacular coral cover down there, and many of those reefs still have yet to recover from the bleaching event 9 years ago. Moving on to 2020, there was another pretty widespread bleaching event, at least in the central Red Sea. We also think in the southern Red Sea, there was a lot of bleaching, but this was during the pandemic, so we had limited access to the field. So we did as much as we could, but we're not sure exactly the entire extent, at least in the Saudi side of the 2020 event. And now the latest event is probably the most well-documented bleaching event in recent history, I think, in terms of spatial coverage, for sure in Saudi Arabia, and I think perhaps for the rest of the Red Sea as well. And so I'm going to also show a couple of maps of heat stress. Now, this is not degree heating weeks like you've seen in the previous two speakers' presentations. These were developed by a recent PhD graduate student from KAUST, Dr. Lily Geneviere, with Ibrahim Hotit's group. He's a professor here at KAUST, and they are climate modelers. And she developed a new Red Sea specific metric for thermal stress, basically using a marine heat wave metric. And her baseline for this thermal stress was 30 degrees C for the sea surface temperatures. And using that metric, you can see even compared to the previous bleaching events, 2023 just blows them all out of the water. It was really hot last year. So I guess it's no surprise that we saw pretty widespread bleaching throughout the Red Sea. And in fact, if we map Lily's model on top of where we have the observations for bleaching, these are where we have records of bleaching from several different groups within our university and the government agencies. And it matches pretty well with what the thermal stress looks like in Lily's model. And conversely, we have limited reports of bleaching up north where it was a little bit cooler, just like Lily's model shows. So at least for this most recent bleaching event, it seems like her metric for heat stress matches pretty well with what we see in the water. So we also are still working through all of this data, partly because we have to, we're trying to synergize data from a lot of different research groups and agencies. So we don't have any hard numbers yet in terms of what was the percentage bleaching in different parts of the Red Sea, but I can show you a few photos that kind of illustrates it for you. So we have a photo here on the left from a PhD student here at KAUST, Brian. He has been doing drone surveys of shallow water reef flats just in front of the university here in KAUST in the central Red Sea. Most of these are Stylophora colonies, but there's also some acroporids, other postuloporids and porites. And you can see this photo was early September, and basically there's 100% bleaching. This was surprising to me. I did my whole PhD here in KAUST on the reef flats here, and I had found the Stylophora were actually fairly resilient to really high temperatures. So they couldn't handle last year, though. There was a lot of bleaching, especially near shore. Likewise, we had another PhD student, Victor. He was spending a lot of time in the water during the event. This is an image from a nearshore reef right in front of KAUST. It's a more diverse assemblage of corals here, about 8 to 10 meters deep, I think. But you can see it doesn't matter what taxa you have, there's basically 100% bleaching. So that story seems to hold up here for the central Red Sea. The nearshore reefs were really, really impacted with bleaching. Now, going into kind of depth bins, I can tell you that the shallow water corals, at least in the central Red Sea, seem to suffer the most. So here's an image from an offshore reef we have that in July of 2023, before the bleaching event. We have pretty nice coral coverage, Millipora in here, Postulopora, even the soft corals here, Xenia. Going back a few months after the bleaching event, everything's dead, including the soft coral. So we actually saw really high soft coral mortality here, which was surprising for some of us. But all we have left is a dead structure and CCA and some turf algae now. Now this actually doesn't hold though when you start to go deeper. So we noticed if you get about 5 to 6 meters or deeper on the reefs, the bleaching was less prevalent and the mortality is less prevalent. And you can go out there today, and the reefs actually look pretty good. They look comparable to before the last bleaching event. And this matches fairly well with some temperature arrays that we had set up from the reef flat all the way down to 30 meters. We had temperature sensors at several depths, and we noticed that the water column was fairly stratified this last summer in the central Red Sea, at least, where the top 5 meters of the water column were about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the water immediately below it. So our mortality and bleaching patterns seem to match what the temperature was looking like as you go deeper. So that stratified water seemed to probably doom the more shallow coral communities, but maybe saved the corals that are a little bit deeper, at least for now. So we'll see what happens as we go forward. So I guess we're also expecting another bleaching event, unfortunately, this year. And what we're trying to do now is coordinate better with these government agencies and other research groups here in Saudi. We're hosting a workshop in a couple weeks here with representatives from all these different groups to try to standardize and coordinate our efforts a little better, so that moving forward, we have a more sort of centralized approach and let's say better coverage and more intentional way of monitoring the reefs in the future. Yeah, so with that, I think that's my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Walter. It's great to hear what's going on in the Red Sea, and also the coordination that you guys are bringing in to have that to better monitor reefs in the Red Sea moving forward is great. Up next, we'll hear from Karen Moahez. She has been leading the Coral Reef Programme at Cordio East Africa since early 2023 and is actively involved in the Red List of Ecosystems for Coral Reefs, and also serves as the Western Indian Ocean regional representative for the GCRMM. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Margot. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, working very well, but the person who is also not on mute, please may you mute yourself.
Thanks, Margot. Yeah, so hi, everyone. As Margot said, my name is Dr. Karen Moahez. I'm a senior scientist and manager with Cordio East Africa and the Western Indian Ocean regional representative. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining. I'll be talking a little bit about how the 4th Global Bleaching Event unfolded in the Western Indian Ocean, some of the challenges that we faced, and some lessons that we've learned so far. So the Western Indian Ocean is a vibrant and vital marine region that spans 10 countries and supports over 60 million people who live within 100 kilometers of its coastlines, and we depend on it for food, livelihoods, and cultural heritage. The marine biodiversity here is both rich and unique, with estimates suggesting that there are between 11,000 to over 20,000 marine species in the region. About 22% of these species are endemic, and the Western Indian Ocean is home to nearly 38% of the world's known coral species. Ocean-related activities in the region are estimated to be over $20 billion annually, positioning it as the 4th largest economy in the region. Our marine environment supports complex and productive populations. However, this also places a responsibility on us, both locally and globally, to manage and protect these resources wisely. So having witnessed the mass bleaching that occurred in the Northern Hemisphere in 2023, we utilized the NOAA Coral Reef Watch products, particularly the predicted coral bleaching heat stress alerts, to plan and prepare. So using that tool, we realized the seriousness of the predicted situation, and we partnered with Reef Resilience Network and with Derek as well to hold a webinar in January titled Preparing, Monitoring and Responding to Coral Bleaching in the Western Indian Ocean. The webinar brought in over 240 attendees from within and beyond the region. During the webinar, we were able to share key resources such as the Coral Bleaching Monitoring Guide for the Western Indian Ocean from Dr. David Obura, where we discussed various monitoring methods for different skills and resources. We also shared the Cordio Indian Ocean Bleaching Form for anyone to be able to report bleaching observations in the region, which allowed us to mobilize a network of marine biologists, managers, divers, and citizen scientists. These key actors played a critical role in the monitoring of the unfolding of the bleaching event. Through this collaborative effort, we were able to then gather this data and then share it directly with NOAA. So the first bleaching report came on January 6, 2024 from the Seychelles, where they were already experiencing moderate bleaching. Closer to the mainland, the island of Zanzibar and the southern parts of Kenya were already showing signs of low bleaching in early January. By February, we started to get more reports of bleaching across the region, with countries such as Mauritius, Comoros, and Tanzania already reporting high levels of bleaching. In Kenya, moderate bleaching was reported with sea temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius. 53 bleaching observations were reported in March, with 26 of those coming from Tanzania. Half of the reported sites were experiencing moderate bleaching, and a couple had already showed high bleaching. Seychelles reported similar levels of low and moderate bleaching, with some sites showing high bleaching. Kenya saw peak water temperatures between 31 and 32 degrees Celsius and reported moderate bleaching. In April, we actually received the first reports of extreme bleaching, which came from Kenya, but 80% of the reports from the country were still describing high levels of bleaching. Similarly, Comoros and Seychelles also reported high levels of bleaching. In contrast, Tanzania reported that only 20% of its surveyed reefs experienced high-level bleaching compared to 60% that were experiencing low bleaching. April also saw the water temperatures come down to 30 degrees Celsius in Kenya. Here we see some incredible shots from Dr. Awood Noster from Reef, based in Shimoni in the south of Kenya, where he was able to show the impact of the bleaching event, comparing two sites in both January and in April. So as we look ahead, our monitoring efforts will continue, and we will be using tools like the NOAA Coral Reef Watch products to help guide our efforts. Currently, the data from NOAA suggests that the intense bleaching stress that we've been experiencing is expected to dissipate by June. We've already observed a decrease in water temperatures, so we've now come down to 29 degrees Celsius in the south of Kenya, which is a hopeful sign that we might be getting some relief. We will continue to monitor the situation closely, try to gauge the full extent of mortality, survival, and recovery data. This ongoing effort includes collecting and sharing data from regional partners and citizen scientists to Cordio, and then we in turn continue to share that information with NOAA. As Cordio, we will continue with our monthly bleaching alerts, at least for this next month, maybe the month after that, depending on the data coming in. So kind of looking back at these last couple of months, we found that we were able to greatly benefit from the NOAA products. They gave us early warnings and allowed us to anticipate the bleaching. Another success was some of the countries in our region demonstrated really good national coordination and collaboration in their monitoring efforts. We also found that the use of citizen science together with researchers across the region that reported bleaching had been a major success for us. However, some of the challenges were around mobilizing and organizing a coordinated regional monitoring and reporting effort. So there was a bit of a lack of a unified regional response, which did make it a bit difficult to share data with NOAA in a timely manner. So the delayed or lack of data from some areas in the region, including those that are waiting until the end of the bleaching event to share findings, has again resulted in some gaps in our current understanding of how the event unfolded and to what extent. Lastly, another challenge has been funding. Some organizations just lacked dedicated resources for bleaching monitoring, so leading to them either diverting funds from other projects or just having minimal monitoring efforts. So as we continue to navigate this coral bleaching event and its impacts, the collective efforts of researchers, citizen scientists, and organizations across the region have once again been proven invaluable. We are immensely grateful to everyone who's contributed over the past few months and to those who continue to share their observations with us. Your dedication not only enriches our understanding, but also enhances our collective ability to safeguard these vital marine ecosystems for future generations. Thank you, Margot.
Thank you so much, Karen, for another detailed overview of what's going on in the Western Indian Ocean. I'm glad to see that temperatures are slowly starting to decrease, which is good news. I'd also like to thank you for your bleaching reports, which we find super useful, and we like to share them on social media and things like that. So thank you for that. Before we move to the next speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you could please speak a little bit slower because it's hard for the interpretation team, which are on the other channels. So just for the next few speakers, can we just maybe slow down a little bit? Thank you. So next we'll hear from Judith Lang. She helped develop the original Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment AGRA protocol in the late 1990s, as well as the original training materials. Judith is going to tell us more about the events unfolding in the Caribbean. So over to you, Judith.
Thank you, Margot. And I will share screen and start my presentation, I hope. Can you see it now?
We don't see it just yet.
You don't see it?
No, not yet.
Well, I am seeing it here, so I don't know why. Oh dear, I better come in again. Are you seeing, you're not seeing it now?
No, we still don't see it.
All right, starting over. Do I have permission to share?
Yes, you should do.
And you're not seeing it?
No, if you're having issues, let me grab it for you.
I don't know why it worked fine earlier.
Oh, we see it now.
You do? Okay.
Yes, working well now.
Fine, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Judy Lang of the Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment. I thank my AGRI colleagues, the Ocean Research and Educational Foundation for supporting our work, and everyone in the Caribbean and beyond who is contributing data to describe this horrific bleaching event, which is still affecting our coral reefs. The fourth global coral bleaching started in February 2023. This is NOAA's Caribbean Degree Heating Weeks product, DHW, for the first of that month. It shows that patches of somewhat warm surface seawater had already appeared in the southern region. A reminder that the new scale goes from 0 to an alert level 1 that starts at 5 DHW and increases now to an alert level 5 at a DHW of 20 or more, and which is probably lethal to the majority of our corals. Now, these initial patches vanished by March 1, but others appeared in the Western Caribbean by June 1, then expanded north by July, and soon engulfed the entire Caribbean, increasing in intensity until peaking it by November 1. They started to moderate over winter, but have appeared again now in the Southern Caribbean. I am not in presentation mode. I am so sorry. Let's get out here. As the entire Caribbean area warmed, so did the geographical area of bleaching as seen in the months between March 2023 and 2024, when survey reports were submitted to our tracking map directly and from the CFAN in Florida. Heat stresses throughout the Western Caribbean in summer 23 greatly exceeded that of any historically known event in our region. For example, by August, degree heating weeks were 17 at an alert level of 4 in Belize, and at 22 in Florida, in the Florida Keys. By this time, many of the more heat-susceptible species like Agaricea plate corals on the left in Panama and these Acropora elkhorn corals in Florida had already bleached. And in the most severely affected areas, like Florida, a majority of the acroporids were already dead. And incidentally, when Belize bleached again, when had a second peak of 21 degree heating weeks in August. By November 1, the entire Caribbean had been engulfed in the accumulated heat stress. Jamaica exemplifies a jurisdiction in which the degree heating weeks had quickly increased to over 24, and where more than 90% of all its wild and nursery spread acropora are estimated to have died. This large stand of elkhorn and staghorn corals exemplifies that fact in October of last year. Many corals also bleached in areas in which the accumulated heat stress was real but less extreme, and their survival was generally higher. For example, in Western Puerto Rico, 30 species were affected, but mortality rates were much lower. Although water temperatures started to decline last December, as you saw, they have remained unseasonably warm and now are increasing. Most of the Caribbean is now under a bleaching watch, as Derek explained. There's a bleaching alert in the southwestern region, plus Nicaragua and eastern Honduras have already reached alert level 1. Throughout our region, some corals have remained bleaching throughout the winter and spring. Others are recovering zooxanthellae, but now are dying from disease, increased levels of predation, or even from unknown causes. Nevertheless, variation at smaller scales than is captured by the resolution of the NOAA products is common, as evident in the Mexican Caribbean, where almost 100% of the naturally abundant but heat-susceptible species of Acropora, Agaricea tenuifolia, and fire corals died over a very short distance, less than 20 kilometers of the coastline south of Cancun when water temperatures exceeded 34 degrees. In sharp contrast to the area immediately to its north, where the thermal stress was 2 degrees cooler, and more bleaching and mortality levels were correspondingly much reduced. Note that the accumulated heat stress further south was variable and intermediately between these two extremes. In another example from last summer, in July, nursery outplants of Acropora bleached in southern Belize, but as shown here, regained zooxanthellae with remarkably little complete mortality overall in comparison to their near total elimination of all acroporids at many sites further north in Belize. So intervening responses last year included various kinds of in situ shading of intact corals or nursery specimens, feeding both underwater and on land in ex situ, with relocation to deeper waters on reefs or onto land and maintenance in either open raceways or closed aquaria. And some lessons learned and recommendations were summarized in a joint webinar yesterday with the Reef Resilience Network. And the link is already available to that at the AGRA website and will soon appear, I'm sure, at the Reef Resilient websites. General takeaways from our experience last year, based on a recent white paper produced in Florida and from other sources, include planning ahead, prioritizing the protection of genetic diversity, acting early when temperatures start to increase, and of course the NOAA products are really helpful with that, monitoring throughout, having regular communications, and as Derek noted, removing harmful predators. Now, the Caribbean region of the GCRMN, coordinated by the SPA, RAC, and Healthy Reefs Initiative, and aided by AGRA plus other volunteers, is working on a new regional summary for our area. Everyone with data to share is encouraged to join this effort. See my email on the title slide if you can contribute and haven't yet been contacted by someone. Thanks, and apologies for the rough introduction.
Thank you very much, Judith, and that went very smoothly, so don't worry about that. It's great to see a little bit more about what's going on in the Caribbean, and also interesting to see the responses that you would put into place in 2023 and the lessons learned moving forward. Our next speaker is Beatrice Pedavoni Ferreira, who is a full professor at the Oceanography Department of the Federal University of Pernambuco. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. Beatrice will elucidate on coral bleaching in Brazil. So the floor is yours, Beatrice.
Thank you, Margot. I will share my screen now. Thank you very much. Can you see it in the presentation mode? Is it okay? Can you see it?
Yeah, perfect, Beatrice.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm here to report the current status of coral reef bleaching in the Brazil region. And as Margot has introduced me, I'm a professor at the Oceanography Department, and I'm presenting on the behalf of the Department of Ocean and Coastal Management, linked to the Secretariat for Climate Change, Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. So in this new administration, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change has a Department of Ocean and Coastal Management that is responsible for the national strategy for coral reefs, and is putting together a hub for coral monitoring and for reporting to GCRMN. So this is our last report for status of the reef, and this is the Brazil region here. You can see in the South Atlantic, Western South Atlantic, we have the only true coral reefs in the South Atlantic, and for the purpose of that report, coral reefs were divided in 3 regions: the Oceanic Islands, the coast of Northeast, and the Abrolhos region at the south. As in many places in the world, many times those regions behave differently regarding effects of warming and coral bleaching. So until 2018, the time of the data of that was included in this report, coral bleaching has been felt and has done damage to the coral reefs, but also we could see some recoveries from local measures, and also some regions that were not so badly affected. And 2023 and 2024 is what we're reporting today, but I must say that 2019 and 2020 changed the situation a lot, because we saw widespread bleaching and mortality, and this has been reported by different teams, by different groups, through publications, and was not in our last report, but certainly will be in the next one. But 2003 and 2004, we knew that things were going to get pretty bad. There was severe bleaching in Florida. It was all reported at the 37th ICRI meeting in Hawaii. So this raised an alert within Brazil for the government. Brazil joined the Coral Reef Breakthrough and organized in January a meeting to form a hub with monitoring teams already ongoing in the country, and to map support needs for monitoring. So in February, feedback was given to researchers on possibilities of financing for work for the ones that didn't have financing already. And in March 2024, bleaching started. And this report I bring today is the results from reports on the surveys that was conducted for different teams. And it's important to say that it's an ongoing event yet, so mortality and even the extent of bleaching will be only known in a few months, I suppose. So here we are in that webinar. So as Derek showed already, the South Atlantic region was hit pretty bad, and it's the coast of Brazil where coral reefs are located is around 2,000 kilometers. The coral reef formations, but there are coral occurs much further south and further north as well. So this is the result from the survey we conducted. Prediction from NOAA virtual stations work pretty well. We can see that the region that was more affected, as you can see in this animation here, is the one where we have more bleaching. Here is the name of some general regions, and in the colors that correspond to the level of stress, we can see both bleaching and mortality. And this is changing all the time. For instance, in some regions where bleaching was was not so intense, reports say now that perhaps it has advanced. So as for mortality, that's been continually monitoring now. Data came from some long-term ecological research sites like ITER sites that are financed by the Brazilian Council for Research. And these ones that have stars are areas for long-term ecological research for coral reefs is being conducted. So we have a good series for these regions. There are also other efforts going on with not so long monitoring lines, but that probably from now on will continue. So what we can see is that we have reached pretty high levels of bleaching. So mass bleaching has happened in the country, and the northeast region is the most affected one. The islands started a bit later, so they were not so affected as time of this report, but bleaching was widespread. But here we have both bleaching and mortality. And the southern region, the good news is that the southern region corresponding to Abrolhos was not so affected so far. And actually temperatures are already dropping that region for other systems of cooling. Another report from Coral Vivo Network had similar results. It was not incorporated to the previous slide because it was not reported yet, but material that was a very similar pattern. So here is sort of some data of how temperature is in the sea, anomalies and El Nino, and also the degree heating week for one of the regions that has been most affected. That's in the center of the northeast. There is also an MPA, the Coral Coast MPA, and what we can see is that not always the strongest El Nino has prompted the worst scenario for this region, like the 2016 didn't have such a strong degree heating week permanence, but we can see a trend of this increasing, and both in length and intensity. So here we see 2019 and 2020, two twin peaks. So we had two events in a row, and now 2024, that's really high. And we have an El Nino here, but we also have reached the 20 level of degree heating week. That's unprecedented for here. And also a very positive trend of increase in temperature anomaly. Well, Brazil has is characterized by a very unique set of reefs. Has a low diversity. We have 23 species of stone corals and 5 species of hydrocorals. And oops, oh, did it get out? Sorry. Sorry about that, guys. I it's something wrong here. And we also have several species that are endemic, and at least 3 of them are red listed as under threat by IUCN. So the losses we have in Brazil are the losses for everywhere because of this endemic species. This one in the middle is a relic species that is extinct everywhere elsewhere, and is one that has been most affected in the Brazilian coast. Another interesting result, not very happy one, is that a survey that has just been conducted by this group from the university and Brazilian agencies, and also sponsored by WWF, went to the seamounts of the northern Brazilian chain and found bleaching, widespread bleaching at 60 meters depth. So at the same time, we had very good news to find very good coral cover in many regions. We had these results of widespread bleaching at this depth. Was very worried. So this area is being proposed as a protected area, but it's certainly one to be monitored in the future. So the outlook is the Northeast Brazilian region, the one that was most affected, has 80 million people living on the coast. That's 40% of all coast population in Brazil. So people are very dependent on those reefs for coastal protection. This is the results of BPBS report. That's the summary for policymakers. The report is ongoing on goods and services and includes goods and services of coral reefs. And we show the importance for coastal community through coastal protection, food security, tourism, well-being, and culture. And so it's those people that will be affected. This event was the most extreme to record, affects severely all but the southernmost region, that's Abrolhos, that, however, was affected during previous events. So the Western South Atlantic is not a climate refugia. Brazilian coral reefs are not tolerant to intense heat as the ones we've seen. Are severe risk in present conditions and trends. Of course, reducing carbon emissions through reduction of fossil fuel consumption and deforestation, and reducing and stopping deforestation, as well as increasing conservation and promoting restoration of local conditions, is essential to prevent extreme loss. The coral reefs in Northeast Brazil, they prevent 660 billion damage and losses. So this is a humanitarian crisis as well. Another news that we have a synthesis center on environmental and climate change that has just started an assessment of the coral reef bleaching crisis, going on side by side with Amazon Tipping Point. So this is also another initiative to integrate the Brazilian research network, and this is us here. We had Derek with us and David Brewer as well in the international team, and many other researchers from Brazil. So these are all the sponsors, and we thank all the people, all the teams, all the projects that so far have contributed to the formation of this very preliminary report, as we are still under alert and monitoring the aftermath of this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, for your detailed overview of what's going on in Brazil. We're very much looking forward for Brazil's leadership during the G20 presidency as well. And thank you for your engagement with the GCRMN and also the Coral Reef Breakthrough.
Thank you.
So our next speaker... Our next speaker is Antoine Paybal. Since 2019, he has been a marine biology and coral reefs policy officer at the Ministry of Ecological Transition of France. As such, he is in charge of coordinating the French Coral Reef Initiative, or IFRICOR, alongside the Ministry of the Overseas. So over to you, Antoine.
Thank you, Marco. Give me a second so I can share my screen. So normally you should be able to see it full screen. And if it's the case, I'm going to start.
We see it, it's all good.
Okay, perfect, thank you. I'm going to give a brief update about the status of the coral reefs in the French overseas territories in the context of the fourth Global Bleaching Event. So just a quick reminder about the French coral reefs. So actually, we have nearly 60,000 square kilometers of coral reefs, which represents around 10% of the global coral reef area. And those reefs are located in the overseas territories in the three oceans. So we have reefs in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific as well. They are located in 11 overseas territories that have different constitutional status, which means they have different degrees of autonomy. And for example, some of them can have their own environmental law, and we have to adapt to this specific context. 90% of the French coral reefs are found in the Pacific territories, so more specifically in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. And those two territories also have a large degree of autonomy, especially regarding the environment issues. And given all that facts, France has an important responsibility and also is committed to protect the coral reefs through our national policies, but also regional and international cooperation. Because of this particular context, we had to create kind of a forum or let's say an initiative to gather all the stakeholders from the different overseas territories so we can share common goals and targets. So that's why we created the French Coral Reef Initiative, IFRECOR, back in 2000, and it was based on the ICRI model. So IFRECOR promotes the protection and sustainable management of coral reefs and associated ecosystems in the overseas territories. To do so, it gathers all the stakeholders, both at both the national level and within each territory, and it is co-chaired by two ministries, the ministries in charge of the environment, which I am working for, and the ministries of the overseas territories. So one of our main action is to produce and support decision making by producing tools and also knowledge with deliverables such as a red list or methodological guidance, maps, etc. And we also operate the French Coral Reef Monitoring Network. It is one of our key activities. Since 2016, we are bound by law to assess the health status of coral reefs, of the French coral reefs and associated ecosystems, mangroves and seagrass meadows, every 5 years. So we have to do this every 5 years. And another of our tasks is to coordinate the different campaigns of monitoring of bleaching events. And this is what I'm going to say a word about. Because in the French overseas territories, the coral reefs monitoring campaigns are led by different structures, could be universities or state agencies or even private companies. And in order to make it all consistent and to work on these results, IFRECOR published a guide back in 2019, and this guide is about to improve the monitoring of bleaching events in order to support the managers and to define standardized operational monitoring protocols. It develops 3 methods, and the main difference between those methods to assess the bleaching, the main difference is depends on the available human and financial resources. And so the 3 methods are the opportunistic data collection. Second one is the visual estimation, and the third one is to use photo quadrats. This guide also sets several priorities. So if we have limited resources, it suggests to put the emphasis on the post-bleaching monitoring, because it can allow to assess the mortality after the event. The guide also recommends the use of coral cover and the percentage of affected cover as basic descriptors, the most basic one if we cannot measure other ones. And it also suggests to focus on historical or sentinel sites, which are sites where we have long-term records, such as the GCRMN stations, the stations where we monitor for the MPAs, etc. And wherever and whenever it's possible, we also suggest to use the photo quadrat method. And today, it is mandatory to follow the recommendations and the methods developed in this guide to unlock public funding for monitoring the bleaching events in the overseas. And to do so, the ministries have an emergency fund of around 50,000 euros every year. I'm going to skip this to save some time, but we have some long-term data series of the past bleaching events in the 3 oceans. So some of them last back to the 80s or even to the mid-70s. So we can clearly see the signs of the global bleaching events, past one and current one. And about the current bleaching event and the current status of our reefs, so I'm going to share with you some of our first results. So first, in the Caribbean, the first signs of bleaching appeared in late August 2023, and they extended to the whole coral communities in September 2023. The first signs of recovery were reported a few months after that, in late November 2023. But overall, the corals experienced over 10 weeks of alert level 2. So this is the NOAA's alert Derek explained as an introduction, and it was level 2 or above. And it's important to keep in mind also that some of our corals were still bleached as late as April, it's a mistake here, 2024, which is really unusual. So in the different territories in the Caribbean, so in Guadeloupe, our experts there reported the situation was catastrophic because on the reef flat, after this 2023 bleaching events, they reported that 80% of the corals were dead. On the reef front, it's only 10% of dead coral, but still 30 to 40% of the corals are still bleached. In Martinique, we could launch 2 monitoring campaigns during the peak of the bleaching event, and later in February this year to assess the impact of the episode. So as a result, we know now that 81% of the coral cover in Martinique was impacted at the peak of the episode. And the post-bleaching campaign reported that around 1/3 of the coral cover was lost after this bleaching event. And back in February this year, we are also able to assess the impact on the different species, and especially 4 common coral species were strongly affected. So species such as Acropora humilis or Agaricia agarichites, and so we have also this kind of data that can be useful, especially if we need to launch restoration operations. And last, in the Caribbean, so in the territories of Saint Martin and Saint Barthélemy, we couldn't launch extensive campaigns. Yet we had some data reported by experts and divers, and they could give us a hopeful note. Because, for example, in Saint Barthélemy, there was no sign of bleaching on remarkable colonies of Acropora located in two bays, so the bays of Grand Cul-de-Sac and the bay of Pointe-Milou. And this is surprising because those are spots where there is a big human activity. So it's a glimmer of hope. Next, let's move to the Western Indian Ocean. So as it was explained, a major bleaching event is currently ongoing in the Indian Ocean. It's about the French territories, it's especially affected Mayotte and the scattered islands. But first, I'm going to give a word on the island of La Réunion. So in La Réunion, the bleaching is not widespread, and only certain zones of the reef flats are affected. However, our experts there reported a high rate of coral diseases that could contribute to increase the vulnerability of the corals to other pressures, such as the water temperature. In Mayotte, we could lead a monitoring campaign on around 100 survey stations all around the island. It was the campaign was led in April. So the numbers, we have 35% of white or pale corals there, and at this point, less than 1% mortality. These numbers are in fact really similar to the 2016 bleaching event, but this year's bleaching event also spreads deeper than we previously observed. So this year we had some bleached corals to at least 25 meters deep. And the survey campaign we led was 1 week before the peak of the bleaching event. So there is still a high risk of mortality, but this we can only know with the post-bleaching monitoring. And in the scattered islands of the Indian Ocean, bleaching is important in Geyser Island, where 38% of the colonies have bleached. So in the Glorious Islands, where this time it's 68% of bleached colonies. And in the island of Juan de Nova, where it's nearly a half of the coral colonies that have bleached. And in the island of Tromelin, we are currently processing the results. And there is no bleaching reported in the island of Europa because the water is cooler there, and this could explain the difference. And finally, in the territories of the Pacific Ocean, so the monitoring campaigns are ongoing or just to be about to be launched. And so today I only have the first alerts and trends to share with you, but no results to share at this point. So first, in New Caledonia, there was an important bleaching event last year, just to have this in mind as a piece of context. And this year, in 2024, there is a massive bleaching that was reported on the east coast of the island. But in the same time, the lagoon or the barrier reef seems to be less affected. And so we are currently working with the agencies there to start and to found and start monitoring campaign. In French Polynesia, there was an important bleaching reported in the Tuamotu Islands, but the Society Islands, so it's where Tahiti is located, for example, this archipelago is less impacted. But because this is a really large territory and they have a very large sea area. In Polynesia, there are large variations between the different islands, and the monitoring campaign is about to be launched. And last territory in the Pacific, it's Wallis and Futuna, but at this stage we don't have any information, and we are currently gathering them. So that's all for me. I just put some additional resources. It's hyperlinks at the end in this last slide. Unfortunately, most of them are only in French, but you can find some documents in English as well if you want to dig further into this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine, for your detailed overview of what's going on in France. And I think it's great to see that you're bound by law to assess the status of coral reefs and associated ecosystems. So that's amazing. Also, thank you for your engagement with the GCRMN. So for those of you that might not know, the GCRMN is an operational network of ICRI, so the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. I'd like to now pass the floor to Jennifer Koss, who will be moderating our discussion session on the next steps and the role of the global coral reef community. We do encourage you all to please have your videos on so that it does have that better feel. It's nice to put a face to a name if you do have questions for that discussion. So I do encourage you to put on your videos now, and I'll pass the floor over to Jennifer Koss.
Thank you. Before we get into the question and answer session, I understand that we may have a speaker from WCS. Is that the case?
So the speaker from WCS, Alfred, he said he might have a colleague who might provide some remarks for the discussion. So if you are that colleague, please do present yourself.
Okay, sounds like not. Okay, well, thank you all for the sobering summary of the impacts of the latest bleaching event. I think we can all echo a hearty goodbye to El Nino. We heard multiple presenters talk about increased collaboration on monitoring, increased reporting of bleaching, and the inclusion of citizen science as a means to verify and quantify bleaching, which is all very exciting. We have a lot more data to work with now. Derek mentioned Thailand closed a coastal area to tourism. If there's an intention to monitor those corals in the closed area compared to areas that were not closed, that would be great information to share. It would also be good to know if there are any other countries who took similar actions in limiting the use of coral areas or perhaps outright closures during these extreme heating events, and what the impact may have been for those closures. So now what do we do with all this information? How should we use it to inform management actions? I was particularly intrigued, and thank you, Antoine, for sharing the bleaching monitoring methods IFRICOR is using. And I'm also intrigued with the policy on releasing funding for monitoring only if the methods are being used. We haven't done that in the United States, and I think our partners would probably be quite vociferous if we said we're not giving you funding unless you adhere to the protocols that were coming up. But I do think it's important to start merging some commonalities on how we collect and share data so that we can aggregate data at the highest levels and tell a global story. And a little bit to that, I just wanted to add that Antoine was able to join us, as well as Judy, on the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force meeting earlier this month, where Derek convened a bleaching workshop where we tried to share best practices on how to monitor bleaching, including standardized methodologies as is feasible. We'll be putting out a paper after some additional follow-up on what we think those shared methodologies should be. So that'll be something that I think we can share with the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, and might be the topic of a future webinar like this. And also another future webinar could also include what sort of recovery are we seeing from these bleaching events, so that we can talk about those things. So with that, I think we'll just open it up to questions from the floor. And I'm not sure, Margot, are those questions going to come in via chat?
I think if anyone has a discussion point or a question they'd like to ask, please just raise your hand and then we'll pass the floor to you. But we really want to encourage discussion. So if you do have anything that wasn't mentioned during the presentations that's ongoing in your region, then please do feel free to speak up and let us know and give us more details there. And then if you do have questions, please do ask them too.
And while hands are going up and questions are coming in, I will ask the speakers, do you see the utility for, and would you be willing to talk more about common methods to assess bleaching, monitor bleaching, and also then talk about what are the things that we can do as managers post-bleaching based on what we're observing. Derek put a little intriguing last sentence in there on what sort of disease events do we see post-bleaching? Are there opportunities to treat those diseases? What's happening with the species that prey on corals? Are there interventions that we can stage to keep snails and other critters from devastating the remaining coral tissue that survives? So I'll open that up to any one of the speakers who might want to comment on that.
Whilst the speakers are having a thought on that one, we do have a question or a discussion point from Margot McMahon as well. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and the organisation you represent.
Thank you. I'm Margot McMahon from Chicago, Illinois. I am in the Midwest, so I am aware of our weather being affected by the coral from the South Pacific. I am wondering specifically about the Golden Triangle. How was that affected, as it's such a core of food for the world, as well as diverse reefs and sea life?
I can speak to that a little bit. So the Coral Triangle is a very, very interesting area, and it has incredibly unique oceanography and complicated oceanography because there's so many different islands. In some regions, it's thought there might be refugia because of naturally occurring upwelling processes. So Raja Ampat in Indonesia experiences a lot of subsurface cooler water because the topography of the islands and the tides cause basically the thermocline to shoal up in that area. So this is an amazing thing because that region has never really experienced a severe bleaching event up until, I mean, hopefully it doesn't bleach now, but it still has not yet experienced a severe bleaching event. So that area is being focused on by the Nature Conservancy and others in terms of, being a really, really potential for a hope spot in terms of being able to persist with climate change. In terms of this event, we do know there's been bleaching in Indonesia, particularly, the southern western parts of Indonesia. Heat stress is ramping up now. Like I said, Thailand, we just learned Thailand is starting to experience severe bleaching. That's not technically in the Coral Triangle, but it's right there on the border with Malaysia. The Philippines, we haven't heard anything about the Philippines bleaching during this event. I was talking to a colleague a few weeks ago from the Philippines. I have not heard, if it bleached in 2023. I don't think it did, as far as we know. But again, right now, our Outlook product is predicting that much of the Philippines and Indonesia will experience bleaching level heat stress in the next few months. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But again, the Coral Triangle is an area that it's so diverse. Well, obviously it's diverse in its corals and its animals and plants, but the physical nature of that area is so diverse. There are so many different habitat types and reef types and island types. And that's probably part of the reason why it's so diverse, because there's all these different niches where, different corals have been living for so long and adapting and all these kind of things. So, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but, I think the big event in the Coral Triangle was 2010. And basically since then, there's been evidence that there's been an increase in heat tolerance a little bit. It's not clear if that's because all the heat sensitive corals just died where they bleached in 2010. And now the tougher, hardier, more heat resistant species are what remain. So that's giving us this false hope that the heat threshold is increasing. But for the most part, I think a lot of areas in the Coral Triangle have thus far done pretty well in terms of climate change and also recovered. I recently read a paper about bleaching in the Philippines. It's severely bleached in 2010, and they were showing pretty good recovery actually in these sites since that bleaching event. And again, this is an area that, unfortunately, there's a lot of dynamite fishing, but the corals, have shown pretty good resilience thus far. Again, I don't know what's going to happen in the next several months or the next several years, but overall, to date, I don't think the Coral Triangle has really experienced a super severe bleaching event. So someone please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just speaking about what I've read and what I know. I don't work there specifically. So if somebody actually works there and can talk about this, take the floor.
Does anyone want to follow up on Derek's comments regarding the Coral Triangle? I see some comments and some, Joni shared a paper that might be useful for folks if they want to follow up in the comment section. Hendra, I see your hand.
Judish.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi. Hi, Margaret.
Go ahead. If you have a comment.
Can I make a comment, Margaret?
Yes, please.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Derek, for explanation. Yes, you're right. So, I was part of the Coral Triangle Initiative for Coral Reef Food, Fisheries and Food Security, National Secretariat. So, yes, we record some what do you call this coral bleaching happens in Indonesia, and also in Malaysia and also the Philippines, but not in the other three countries. I think the data that we collect by our, especially for Indonesia, for example, we have the network which is led by our Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, but working together with the NGOs, together with the professional divers and also the diver that's spread all over Indonesia. And they have already developed a kind of like reporting system adopted from the NASA and also NOAA system. And if I remember, but I'm not the expert on that one, so I can, but if I remember correctly, of one of my colleague finding fact, it was happens in 2019 and also 2014 coral bleaching. But I might wrong, but I don't have any exact data, but I can pass to my colleague regarding about the coral bleaching. Now the coral bleaching node, we have standardized, especially in Indonesia, with the ICRI, together with our node in the East Asia node, how to make sure that the data can be recorded, and we have the comprehensive and yearly data for the coral bleaching. Thank you, Margaret.
Jen, you're on mute.
Judy, you are next up. I see your hand.
I thought I'd taken it down, and so I posted a comment regarding Raja Ampat. Dr. Phil Dustin was in the area of the Dampier Straits last month, and there hasn't been any bleaching there. The water flow is so strong as to mitigate the heating. But there are a lot of new villages that have sprung up to accommodate diving tourism, and off every single one of them, coral diseases were rampant that he had not seen 2 years ago. So he is extremely disturbed by the effect of the development that is supposed to be helping the blue economy and, in fact, destroying the reefs, even in the absence of heat stress. And that's all I know about about that area. But I think it is worth sharing.
No, very worth sharing, and a good reminder to us that we still need to manage those local stressors like land-based sources of pollution, sediment, fishing, that these corals are vulnerable, and not just to climate change. There's all those things that caused a lot of degradation prior to climate change becoming the primary threat to corals. David Wackenfeld, I said, looks like you sent me a comment there about moving on to the next question. Did you want to take the floor?
I didn't want to interrupt the flow of conversation about the Coral Triangle, but if that's drying up, I'm happy to make an observation. I think historically, both just generally monitoring the long-term health of coral reefs, but also specifically assessing the impact of bleaching events and trying to get a sort of coordinated global picture of that has really suffered from the fact that different parts of the world have got very, very different levels of expertise. You know, some parts of the world have got lots and lots of coral reef scientists who are right there on the doorstep ready to do the work, and other places simply don't. And I don't think that's ever going to change. But what is emerging, I think, as a game changer globally is the use of AI platforms to analyze images and convert them into data. And of course, you do need to be an expert to do your own coral reef benthic transect or coral bleaching assessment, but you do not need to be an expert to take a good underwater photograph that can then be used by AI to generate data. And of course, the AI can be running on a computer that is thousands and thousands of kilometers away from where the photo was taken. It doesn't matter. So I know that there is more than one platform that does this globally. At AIMS, we have developed a platform called Reef Cloud, which we are using with colleagues in the Philippines, in Brunei, in Vietnam, in Samoa, in a couple of other places. It seems to be going really well. And so I think these AI platforms, and obviously I'm putting in a plug for AIMS and Reef Cloud, quite shameless about that, but they really do provide an opportunity to break through that expertise barrier. You know, you just need a digital camera and you need to know the parameters of the photo that you need to take, and then you can be part of a global endeavor wherever you live, because you can upload your photograph and then the system will send you reports about the data that are within that photograph. The nut that we haven't cracked yet is to use those AI systems to assess the severity of bleaching. So yes, we can determine different types of hard coral, different types of soft coral, turf algae, whatever, and that's great for long-term monitoring, but we don't actually have the ability to really detect, you know, paling from bleaching, etc. But we are using this event to work on that. And so, Jen, I would say that, you know, hopefully in the future with a little bit more R&D and not the too distant future, we can really look to photographically based monitoring that then feeds into AI to provide a global standard and equalize that problem of, you know, some places have got lots of marine scientists and other places don't. So I'm hopeful for the future that that will make a big difference.
Thank you, David. And I think there's also some hope that some of the more remote sensing that can be done through satellites or through airborne surveys using LiDAR, different technologies are popping up, but it's sort of trying to figure out how accurate are those, how much do we need to ground truth, and how can we share those platforms to make them more globally relevant. So I saw a hand go up here. Gonzalo.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for organizing this. So my question is also following up on the previous point, is when you make like these global efforts to try to assess the bleaching with this like call of actions, how do you handle, like, how do you consider the time when the bleaching is reported? Because we know that the bleaching is going on in different places of the world at different times. Do you need to wait until the end of the bleaching event and later you only consider the ones that are like kind of during the peak? Do you follow up, with the people that have previously reported some bleaching to know, did these corals die? Did these corals came back? I'd like to know what is your piece of advice on this matter.
I think that's a great question. And I think that's what we were trying to get at with our U.S. Coral Reef Task Force bleaching workshop. So maybe either Derek or Antoine, based on your experiences, where we want to go with during bleaching, post bleaching, and then subsequently after that to monitor the fate and recovery of corals. A few comments from either one of you.
Yeah, I can start the discussion. So, I mean, in a perfect world, what we want is eyes on the reef basically all the time, right? I mean, because what happens in the Caribbean and what appears to be, disease seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in the Indo-Pacific as well, unfortunately. But in the Caribbean, oftentimes a lot of the corals will survive the bleaching events. What happens is during recovery, you have disease outbreaks, and the Caribbean is just, I mean, I want to use politically correct terminology. The Caribbean is just teeming with coral diseases. I mean, there's a lot of coral diseases. Recently had the emergence of stony coral tissue loss disease, which is turning out to be the worst one yet. But anyway, so these diseases pop up and they can basically kill off corals that survive the heat. So in a perfect world, we want to understand the timing of that. Is that a predictable thing? Is it predictable that is it 9 to 12 months after bleaching that white plague pops up? When does Skittle D pop up? We know black band disease, is exacerbated by temperature. So that peaks during bleaching, but things like stony coral tissue loss disease actually go away during times of heat stress, which is really bizarre. So we want to be able to identify the timing of these disease events and also assess if there's coral predators moving in and targeting, specific corals. So one of the big issues in the Caribbean is that the acroporid corals have become so rare in essence, and these snails like to eat acropora. So what ends up happening is you have so little living tissue left that all these snails just kind of pile on and basically eat it to death, essentially. So this is a long-winded way of me saying that we need as many observations as possible, but again, that's not feasible in reality because we can't just park ourselves on a reef or have a camera sitting there 24/7. So, I think a bare bones, you want to try to hit that peak bleaching, peak heat stress time point for your monitoring. And then, there's different monitoring programs. Some go out 3 months after the heat stress, some go out 6 months. I think 3 to 6 months after the heat stress is also good to determine the impacts and see what recovery is happening. But again, in the Caribbean, the impacts can be delayed upwards of 2 years. So we really need a time point down the road as well to gauge that subsequent disease-driven mortality that might take years to progress. But in terms of documenting mortality from bleaching, you really need fixed monitoring sites to document the mortality, because if you're just using, stratified random designs are great for documenting status and trends over large spatial scales, but it's, unless you're going back to the same exact corals every time, your estimates of mortality are not going to be super robust. So, we need as many time points as possible. As a bare minimum, in terms of gauging mortality, you want pre-bleaching, max bleaching, post-bleaching. But again, if you have limited resources, I would say, you want pre-bleaching and then post-bleaching, because I think mortality is the metric we really need to be getting at, right? Yeah, bleaching prevalence is important because it can inform us about other things, but at the end of the day, we got to know what's dying and how much is dying and which species are dying, essentially, and what's surviving. So those are my 2 cents on that. But hopefully that's good seed for more discussion.
Thanks, Derek. And I would say also take a look at those that survive to see if they spawn in the next season or the season after that. David Wackenfeld, I see your hand up.
So actually just sort of connecting that question to the one in the chat from Clara about how does work on monitoring coral reefs help support local and regional remediation plans? At the end of the day, pardon the pun, in the heat of a coral bleaching event, what everybody wants to know, especially the media, is how much is dead. And certainly here we get journalists asking all sorts of leading questions where they're just begging you to say, oh, it's the worst bleaching ever on the Great Barrier Reef, or some version of that, or the Great Barrier Reef is dead. They want headlines. But if anything, what's more important than how much is dying or dead is how much is left alive and where, because you can't save dead coral, but understanding the distribution of what you have left so that you can instigate on the Great Barrier Reef, the absolute key is crown of thorn starfish control. It is the single most important thing that we can do to turn around coral decline trajectories into coral increase trajectories, and we've demonstrated that we can achieve that at a whole of coral reef or regional scale. But you have to know where the coral has survived. And that's what drives your remaining conservation efforts. And so just building on what Derek was saying, obviously we would love to have sort of real-time monitoring systems that daily report on what corals are doing everywhere, but we're never going to have that, I don't think, even with technology and AI and other developments. But it's getting the balance right between reacting in an event, which is important because, never waste a good crisis. We need to know what's happening. We need to communicate to people. These are the real and present dangers of climate change. But at the same time, that event-driven monitoring needs to sit within a broader framework of long-term monitoring so that you understand the dynamics of recovery, disease. I always worry about calling it a bleaching event because to any normal person, an event is over in a week. A coral bleaching event isn't over in a week. It can actually play out over multiple years. It just shifts from the northern to the southern hemisphere. And then there's the lag between the thermal stress and the disease that Derek was talking about. So we've got to get the balance right between responding to a specific event to document that, but at the same time, keeping an eye on the longer term dynamics, which are what feed information for driving management like crown of thorn starfish control. And our experience here is that that can work really well as a collaboration between, dedicated scientific endeavors and community monitoring. So, we have our Reef Eye on the Reef program that the Reef Authority runs. That provides a lot of information for their crown of thorns monitoring. It doesn't all have to be driven by, coral reef experts.
Thanks, David. And I think we may have time for one more comment. Clovey?
I was just desperately writing it in the box, but if we have got time, I just wanted to say that just bringing the marine tourism industry, specifically the diving industry, into the conversation, especially I'm hearing these wonderful things about AI and photographs, etc., and wanting eyes on the reef, and there being a lack of resources, lack of marine scientists. The diving industry is on the reef every day. So we're working with PADI, the lead training agency, and Derek has been working with them as well on a program, a pilot scale program to start trying to engage the diving industry in the coral bleaching monitoring that we're looking to roll out. And so any advice from anyone on that, or just to keep it on our minds as well. I was just wanted to raise that.
No, I think it's important to think about our citizen scientists and industry partners that can help be those eyes on the reef and sources of data. Sorry, I have a cat that's decided she needs to be part of the webinar. Margot, how are we on time? Can we take one more comment?
We're bang on 2 o'clock, or 3 o'clock even now. So Jen, if you'd like to wrap up with your closing remarks, and then if anyone does have more questions, please just pop them in the chat with who they're directed to, and we can come back to you with the answers to those.
Absolutely, and I think we can see from the level of interest, this is a topic that's going to continue to be pursued, at least within the ICRI and definitely in the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network realm. So probably more ideas on standardizing monitoring during and post bleaching, and ascertaining what sort of actions can we take to preserve the corals that do weather through these events. So I think the webinar participant level peaked at 250 people, which is phenomenal. Really a great turnout. David had started to talk about this. Another future conversation I think would be good about how do we message around these devastating events like that and not fall into the trap of the doom and gloom and just providing these really big headlines about the death of corals, and really impress upon people that there are reasons for hope, and that ecosystem values of corals are so important and so intrinsic to the very survival of the people who live in these areas that this is not something that can be written off. It's not a single species. This is existential for an entire ecosystem and hundreds of millions of people that depend on these reefs. How do we turn that conversation around from being doom and gloom? Something I think about on a daily basis. I've noted that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority reef health updates provided by Roger Beeden are really great to watch. It's very truthful. They're not candy coating anything, but he's also hopeful in the messaging. So while we all don't have the equivalent resources to do that, how can we purvey the sense of hope, and the time is now to turn the tide for corals, and not get sucked into that everything is horrible. I know that Derek's done numerous interviews since the announcement of the bleaching event, and even if he does pepper his remarks with what are we doing about it, here are some bright rays of hope, those things don't always get picked up. But I want to thank everybody for participating and everybody staying on as long as they have. I think this is the beginning of an amazing conversation, and something that we'll definitely pick up on in our fall in-person ICRI meeting in Saudi Arabia. So with that, thank you to the Secretariat for organizing this and our translators, and thank you everybody for participating. I hope this is good food for thought and spurs a lot of future conversations and sharing of ideas.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those great concluding remarks, particularly the existential for an entire ecosystem. I think that's important. So move away from the doom and gloom and into that hope. So just to let you all know that all of this information will be shared via email after the webinar, and it will include a link for the recording, presentations, and additional resources, but they'll also be found on the dedicated ICRI events page. For a list of upcoming webinars, please head to the Coral webinar page, which is linked just here. And also there's a QR code for the ICRI Bleaching Hub where a lot of these resources are. So a big thank you to all our speakers for your informative presentations, and to our partners of the webinar, the Reef Resilience Network hosted under the ICRI chairmanship of the USA, as well as our financial supporters, the Principality of Monaco and the Government of Sweden. Lastly, thank you to all of you for your time in attending this webinar, and we really look forward to welcoming you to the next ones. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.